see that the education system is being used as a weapon against Ukrainian identity in occupied territories. There are books that are being destroyed and replaced with Russian ones. Teachers are being intimidated.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Western media has generally forgotten about Ukraine. I remember when Russia first invaded in 2022, I remember sitting down and watching the countless news clips, reading so many online articles, watching interviews, condemnations, declarations of support, and now there's barely anything. Now it's all about narratives and buzzwords, deterrence, security guarantees, the coalition of the willing. What little attention there is focuses purely on the politics or the battlefield. But for the last 3 years, there's been a different kind of hell unfolding right before us that we never bothered to notice. That being the situation in the territories that have since fallen under Russian occupation. This mainly pertains to the 4 oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, which Russia annexed in their entirety but really only barely controls Luhansk. If the situation there is discussed at all, then it's usually in the context of a peace settlement and the respective positions of both countries. Russia maintains that these lands are legally part of the Russian Federation and that Ukraine is occupying its rightful territory, whilst Ukraine refuses to recognise the legitimacy of that, citing that their acquisition was a violation of international law. What's actually happening in the territories that Russia controls is systematic ethnic cleansing, and YouTube's big no-no phrase cultural genocide. And there is no arguing against that, it is definitively genocide. The abduction of Ukrainian children is the most pressing issue, it being one of the reasons that a UN arrest warrant was given out for Vladimir Putin in 2023. Everything that the Russian authorities are doing in the occupied territories, from simple acts like depriving access to outside communications to indoctrinating Ukrainian children in so-called warrior camps, and press ganging Ukrainian men into meat battalions will reach a tipping point. Something which I think not enough people consider is that the longer that Russia controls these lands, the harder it will be for Ukraine to reintegrate them, if they regain them in the first place. Once that tipping point is reached, then everything Russia is doing will become irreversible. This brings me to the point of this video, which aims to answer a few questions. Firstly, what methods is Russia using to administer and integrate these territories? Secondly, how is life for ordinary Ukrainians and children? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, can the occupied territories ever be reincorporated into Ukraine again? Now, before I get called out as a NATO propagandist or a spreader of Western disinformation, I've included a list of sources in the description that I've used for this video, including ones from various organisations like the UN, the Institute for War Studies, and various other academic articles. I will also warn that some of the things discussed here are quite sensitive and aren't suitable for certain audiences. To fully understand what exactly is happening in the occupied territories, we need to have a quick look at the history of Russian assimilation. Since the dawn of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, Russia has tried to assimilate territory through a process of Russification, that is, making a region's population adopt a Russian identity through various means. These methods have included suppressing local culture, promoting the teaching of the Russian language in schools, moving ethnic Russians in to displace native populations, and so on. In the 19th century, Imperial Russian bureaucrats used the terms Rossisky and Ruski. Rossisky corresponded to Russia's geographic extent, whereas Ruski referred to people of Russian ethnicity. At its core, the Russian Empire was a multinational state, but with a very clear hierarchy. Great Russians at the top, followed by Ukrainians, Belarusians, and others. The logical way to secure everlasting control over their vast conquests was to ensure that its people felt personal loyalty to the empire, and the best way to do that was to make them feel Russian. Two prominent cases of Russification were that of Poland and Crimea. Russia gained control over Poland following the last partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1795. In the decades after, the Russian authorities attempted to impose Orthodox Christianity and the Russian language amongst the populace through either education and/or subjugation of the Polish elite. Common but not necessarily unique to Russification was the targeting of children, as their identities usually hadn't fully solidified. If the next generation could be made to forget their cultural and ancestral roots, then that culture would in theory eventually disappear. The problem was that Poland in particular had a long history of statehood, with a very strong literary tradition and identity, meaning that Russification efforts never really worked to the extent that St. Petersburg desired. In the case of Crimea, things were quite different. Annexed in 1783, the peninsula became a crucial base for Russia's projection of power in the Black Sea. As thousands of indigenous Crimean Tatars fled their homes, the Tsarist authorities invited Christians from across the empire to settle there. This process continued over the 19th century, gradually transforming Crimea into a multi-ethnic region. The aim was relatively simple. Uprooting native communities and disrupting national cohesion would in theory prevent large uprisings. In 1944, Soviet deportations of Crimean Tatars turned them into a minority, and all but eradicated traces of their culture from Crimea itself. Following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the culture of Crimean Tatars was again suppressed, and attempts to bring in Russian settlers began anew. Similar to other forms of national assimilation, there are certain patterns to the process of Russification. First is the hijacking of local education in order to mould young children into future Russian citizens, and the spreading of state narratives to aid in this. Second is the imposition of the Russian language as a key method of erasing native culture. And third is the systematic restriction of civil liberties to deter resistance and exert absolute control. And all of that is happening right now in Russian-occupied Ukraine. At the time this video is being made, Russian control extends to over 115,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, which is an area slightly larger than that of Honduras. This includes a population that Jade Meglin, a researcher at King's College London, estimates at 3.6 million Ukrainians. And of these, at least 615,000 are young children, according to the US-based think tank the Institute for the Study of War. Since their annexation in September 2022, the occupied territories have experienced violations of human rights that a 2024 United Nations report classed as both persistent and systematic. At the start of the occupation, the Russian army identified members of local communities as threats and detained them, often without charge. This was followed by the use of torture and interrogation techniques to extract information, with the range of people considered to be a threat widening the longer the occupation continued. Other cases of human rights violations, including sexual violence, summary executions, and the use of force to quell peaceful protests, have been widely recognised, with at least 30 reported cases of civilians being executed during detentions, just in the period between March and May of 2022. Since then, Russian methods for integrating the occupied territories have become far more systematic. For example, the military indoctrination of Ukrainian children has been a key tool in the Russian arsenal to erode Ukrainian culture. An ISW report from March 2025 identified the locations of 4 so-called warrior camps, where through parades and a Kremlin-approved curriculum, children are exposed to Russian narratives that Ukraine is a Western-backed puppet state full of gay, drug-addict fascists. They're taught that where neo-Nazi Ukraine has failed them, dear Mother Russia is there to protect them. The fundamental aim here is to turn Ukrainian children into blank slates and forcibly instill a sense of Russianness, with an emphasis on preparations for future military recruitment. To that end, Russian indoctrination possesses a hyper-militaristic flavour that signifies commitment to ensuring a state of perpetual conflict with Ukraine, both as a state and as a culture. Russia reportedly allocated over $800 million alone for the indoctrination of children in July, and that almost $1 billion was spent in 2024 overall. The fact that so much money is spent shows that assimilation is one of Russia's primary objectives. What's more, intertwining military and civic education in the hopes of preparing a future generation for some inevitable conflict is a hallmark of an openly fascist state that can only exist in opposition to an all-encompassing enemy. The abduction of children is another crucial part of the campaign to eradicate Ukrainian identity. Since 2022, thousands of children have been taken to Russia and put up for adoption, often being given new Russian names and subject to terrible living conditions and abuse. This has been the most tangible impact of Russia's occupation in terms of garnering international attention. On the 6th of August, the head of the Save Ukraine charity reported that occupation authorities had launched a catalogue for the adoption of Ukrainian children, separated and categorised based on eye and hair colour. This system already exists in Russia proper, but has been gradually implemented in the occupied territories. Considering the Nazis used similar physical characteristics to select which Eastern European children they would Germanize, it's clear that the Kremlin has found some inspiration. For adults, the situation is equally horrific. A common strategy of Russian integration efforts is that of passportization, basically forcing people to adopt a Russian passport and to become, at least on paper, a Russian citizen. This serves two purposes. Firstly, it gives the Kremlin a claim that they're fighting to liberate territory inhabited by Russian citizens, similar to the narrative used by Nazi Germany to justify its annexation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia in 1938. The second is that it's used as a precondition for access to basic services and general treatment in the occupied territories. A Russian citizen will have no problem accessing a doctor, but if you're a Ukrainian national, then good luck. Want to get from point A to point B without a Russian passport? Not happening. Ukrainian men have also been forcibly enlisted into the Russian army to fight against their own homeland, in direct breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. On the 11th of August, the Ukrainian state-run website United24 reported that men who were given Russian passports in Mariupol were being mobilized to fight. Back in 2022, the West Point Military Academy reported the same occurrences in Donetsk and Luhansk, showing that again this is a long-term systematic process. Passportization is the most basic strategy of Russian consolidation, which the Kremlin announced that they had completed in March 2025, with 3.5 million passports issued. This number, of course, should be taken with a considerable grain of salt, but signifies that the first stage of integration is more or less finished. On a recent episode of Ukraine the Latest, which is a British daily podcast by The Telegraph, it was found that Russian authorities had installed software on mobile phones sold to Ukrainians, which could be fully monitored, even more so than the messaging app Telegram. With the suppression of access to foreign media, people in the occupied territories are increasingly living in a Russian-dominated infosphere, and placed in situations where their faith in Ukraine is gradually eroded. For example, if a guerrilla fighter or civilian protester no longer genuinely believes that their homeland will liberate them, then what can justify continued resistance? They'll eventually reach a point where they feel they have no choice but to submit to the occupying power. And this is all part of the ultimate aim to create blank slates. Psychologically break people down into those that can be moulded into what the Kremlin envisions as perfect Russian nationals. Alongside Russia's efforts to integrate the occupied territories are resistance movements carried out by Ukrainian nationals and various Ukraine-aligned partisan groups. The more overt of these, including everything from assassinations of collaborators to regular sabotage, have received media attention over the years. But passive resistance by civilians continues, even in urban centres where Russian administration is the most intense. In a report by Jade McGlynn, passive resistance has been instrumental in resisting cultural assimilation. For example, secret Ukrainian language classes counteract efforts to spread the Russian language, akin to Irish hedge schools in the mid to late 19th century, which taught children the Irish language, despite English efforts to eradicate it. Education itself is a crucial part of resistance, as retaining a cultural link is vital in maintaining a distinct Ukrainian identity, especially in the face of cultural oppression. Other actions are more passive still, with something as simple as refusing Russian license plates or passports, or refusing to partake in referendums, all of which undermine the legitimacy of the occupation regime. Some of the largest non-violent resistance organisations operating in occupied Ukraine are Zlamavka and the Yellow Ribbon Movement, with their actions centred on publicly demonstrating Ukrainian cultural symbols. Violent resistance has similarly proved a thorn in the side for the authorities. The most well-known partisan group includes Atesh, formed by Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in 2022. Over the last few years, they've claimed responsibility for killing Russian soldiers, destroying key military assets, and sending sensitive intelligence to the Ukrainian army. But there are other more localized groups, including SROK near Mariupol and the Berdyansk Partisan Army. The sheer fact that these groups continue to operate after 3 years of occupation is testament to Russia's inability to crush the people they thought they had liberated. So the question becomes if and how Ukraine can regain these territories and reincorporate them into civil society. There are really two different answers to that question, but both are interrelated. The first and most obvious is that it really depends on whether Ukraine can militarily retake that territory from Russia. Based on the strategies that Russia has used to cement control, it's clear that they intend to keep the land that they've captured. It's almost impossible that Russia will simply give away what they've conquered in a peace deal. That's also ignoring the fact that Russia as a state has become existentially reliant on conflict. Putin can't simply throw in the towel and call it a day without declaring absolute victory. The Russian economy itself is geared toward war, just as Nazi Germany's was. And it's for that reason that I personally believe Ukraine can only reclaim their territory on the battlefield. The second answer to that question is that it'll only become more difficult as time goes on. If this war indeed becomes a frozen conflict, then Russia will simply have more time to consolidate their control. More children will be indoctrinated into believing Russian narratives. The Ukrainian language will erode further, and people will have no choice but to comply with the occupation authorities. Resistance may carry on for many years, but even this will eventually wither away. Eventually, Ukrainian culture itself will disappear. And that's a fact that so many diplomats just willfully forget when discussing a peace settlement. Using their favourite phrase of letting Russia keep the occupied territories de facto but not de jure doesn't change the reality of what people in those lands experience. But let's envisage a scenario where, through various means, Ukraine does end up reclaiming that territory in the future. Firstly, there would need to be extensive de-Russification, from changing street signs to reintroducing school curriculums. Reversing the indoctrination of children would require both time and immense resources, as would dealing with collaborators. The best case study for this lies in the liberation of territory following the Ukrainian counter-offensives of 2022. After the recapture of parts of Kharkiv and Kherson Oblast, villages that were freed held deep divisions. Many people that collaborated with Russian forces fled for fear of reprisals, but those that remained were faced with punishment. That being said, the nature and motivation of each person's collaboration is incredibly nuanced. Some may be coerced into it to protect their families, or may be forced to do it under duress. Under international humanitarian law, collaboration doesn't extend to workers providing essential services even under occupation. However, this isn't the case under Ukrainian law. For example, between 2022 and 2023, 447 guilty verdicts were given to people that had provided essential services like water and education to the Russian authorities. So where exactly is the line drawn between treason and coercion? The complexity of collaboration has been common throughout history, especially in the case of the Second World War, which continues to divide Ukrainian society to this day. In the occupied territories, people are encouraged to denounce anyone who is pro-Ukraine, culminating in an atmosphere of distrust that has remained even after liberation. How can a society function without trust? Each instance of collaboration has to be treated on a case-by-case basis, and all of this will take years. Time is running out. Again, the longer Russia has to cement their control, the harder it'll be for Ukraine to reintegrate those territories. But it's not all bleak. Resistance continues, and Ukrainian culture remains. If it can survive decades of Russification under the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, then it will take much more than Moscow estimates to eradicate it. This isn't a situation like Finland losing Karelia and trying to reclaim it 70 years later, or even France losing Alsace-Lorraine. As long as Ukrainian culture survives, then there is hope. And as long as there is hope, there is survival. Thank you so much for sticking around this far. There's a whole lot more I wanted to say about the situation in Ukraine that I couldn't possibly fit into this video. For one thing, the battlefield situation is looking ever more bleak, with news that Pokrovsk is almost entirely encircled, at least at the time that I'm finishing this video. Europe is again moving at a snail's pace when trying to do literally anything to support Ukraine, and America, well, let's face it, can be considered a neutral party to the war, at best. And my thoughts go out to all of the families caught in this conflict that nobody asked for, aside from that, insipid fuck that sits inside the Kremlin. I'll probably make another video highlighting some of my own views of how everything has gone down in the last year. So on that note, do like the video if you found it interesting, subscribe to stay up to date, and as always, I'm Erivik. Stay safe in these dark days, and I'll see you in the next one.